assume like every other unfortunate officer, you've been maced as well.
Yes, sir.
Does your nose run when you've been maced?
Yes, sir.
Wouldn't it have been a calming kindness for someone to be able to blow their nose into toilet paper and flush it?
It might have been, yes, sir.
Without times, how could you render an opinion on when Baker should have been taken off the ring?
Again, just much like the investigation, it was a totality of the circumstances.
Well, aren't you supposed to take somebody off the ring as soon as they're calm and able, and you don't think there's an issue anymore?
Typically, that's what we would do, yes, sir.
Would it be typical to leave someone injured on the ring for 12 minutes?
Without being in that circumstance, I mean, I can't necessarily answer that.
Would you have left someone injured on the ring for 12 minutes?
Without being in that circumstance, sir, it's hard for me to say.
After we had this review today, do you feel like there are other things you could have looked into and things you could have done better?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Redirect.
Sergeant, you'd say that
Let
about
me ask you
every
a question first. Are you going to be long, because I think we're about ready for a break here?
with him.
Finish this up. Yes.
No, I'll get him done in a few minutes.
Okay, good, let's go ahead.
Sergeant, you could say that about any investigation you ever did, couldn't you?
Probably, yes,
You
sir.
could always look back and say, oh, I could have done that better, I could have done that better.
Probably, yes, sir.
I'm gonna work backwards here a little bit. There was just discussion a moment ago about taking somebody off the ring once they are calmed down. And whether you would do that and leave somebody there 12 minutes. Would you do it if they were saying they were gonna kill you?
That might be a reason to keep them on the ring, yes, sir.
Might be, huh?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. When's the first time anybody ever brought up to you the fact that, good God, you allowed me to speak in Rob Sanders' interview?
When was the first time that was brought up?
Yes.
Just now.
Today,
Yes, sir.
2 years plus after this investigation was conducted.
Yes, sir.
When was the first time that anybody suggested that you could have offered to get a written statement from Mr. Baker?
I don't recall that coming up before today.
So today.
Yes, sir.
When was the last time somebody suggested that you attempt to violate HIPAA by trying to get somebody's medical records from the hospital without their consent?
I objected.
Why?
It's a conclusion of law, and that if he doesn't have the knowledge, he can't say that that's true. There's exceptions to HIPAA. Some of them I don't apply.
I'm not familiar with the exceptions to HIPAA, but I'm pretty familiar with HIPAA, and I think it's tough to get those records. I mean, there's something to do with law that you can't.
Could have asked for a subpoena to get the records.
But- Any problem with that argument, to have asked for a subpoena? Well, I understand HIPAA, HIPAA's tough. So maybe, didn't think of that properly, I guess.
Well, then,
But nobody's asked about that before, that's always a question.
and you want to start talking about subpoenas, we go into a whole different row about what do you got to file and what is the court allowed to do and discovery and all that sort of stuff. Just go out and get a subpoena for medical records, it doesn't work that way.
This was for an administrative investigation, as opposed to a criminal investigation, which we would normally.
So that might have been pretty tough, yes.
I'm just saying that there's options, and the conclusion of law is unfounded here. It may be tough, but it's not impossible.
All right, so it may not be a conclusion of law here, but he didn't do it regardless. He didn't consider it. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I'd say that was a fair statement, yes, sir.
When was the first time anybody brought up the fact that there's no written timeline in the investigative file?
I don't recall that being brought up before today.
All the videos are time-stamped, aren't they?
Yes, sir, I believe so.
And you specifically reference amounts of time, don't you?
It's possible, I don't know which specific section, if you can refer me to anything in particular.
Well, we all seem to know that it took 12 minutes before the medic showed up, right?
I didn't know that, I couldn't tell you that before we stepped in here.
Okay. When's the first time anybody suggested that you should have gotten the MACE policy in this investigation?
I don't recall that being an issue.
this issue of focusing on the actual use of force policy versus the general code of conduct. What is it that the code of conduct says as far as force? 103.01, to use reasonable force?
If I remember correctly, it's fairly brief with regards to force. It's at least what I know in the report, it's one paragraph and then a subsection with one heading that says officers shall use only reasonable force to accomplish lawful objectives.
That's it, that's all it says, right?
That's all I have quoted here, yes, sir.
And as an internal affairs investigator, you know that the duty to use reasonable force is informed and shaped by the use of force policy, isn't it? So when you investigate under the use of force policy, what you're doing is you're figuring out if reasonable force was used, right?
Yes, sir.
Mention that the section in the report about abusive or improper treatment was smaller. You said it's smaller in comparison to the force review.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Have you ever been exposed to some standard or rule or regulation or practice about what parameters go around abusive or improper treatment of a prisoner?
No, sir, not that I can remember.
Have you ever been exposed to anything that you're aware of that's outside of your policy and procedure that would inform how you're supposed to know whether something's abusive or improper?
If I understand your question correctly, no, sir.
Because what you do is to figure out if they're abusive or improper, you look to the policies and procedures of the departments to try to figure it out, right?
And compare them against what happened. Yes, sir.
Compare them against what happened. Otherwise, deciding whether something is abusive or improper becomes a completely and utterly subjective inquiry, doesn't it?
Yes, I would say there would be some subjective aspects to that.
Okay? I could say that it's abusive to put that guy in a holding cell at all. You're denying him human comfort. That's abusive.
I object, it's argumentative.
That is
It's not
arguable,
force.
sustained.
You and I could have very, very different interpretations of what's abusive or improper, right?
Yes, sir.
As far as a prisoner goes.
Yes, sir.
Okay? And you're not aware of any standard within the Columbia Police Department that better defines abusive or improper treatment other than the policies and procedures.
No, sir, not off the top of my head.
Very, very briefly and lastly, there was a quick mention about Sergeant Houston's interview and where Rob Sanders said, that Houston said that Sanders said Mr. Baker had taken a step forward. Just a brief mention of that. Do you recall that?
I remember something to that effect, yes,
Okay.
sir.
On page 15 of your internal affairs report, which is Exhibit B,
Yes, sir.
there's a discussion about that actually, isn't there?
Yes,
In
sir.
those last few paragraphs. And in fact, Sergeant Houston said he really couldn't specifically say how or what Officer Sanders had said when he said Baker approached him, right?
Yes, sir, that's what
And then,
summarized.
when asked how sure he was Officer Sanders had made the comment that Baker had approached him, Sergeant Houston responded that he wasn't sure. Sergeant Houston stated as we spoke, he did not specifically recall Officer Sanders making that statement. I read that correctly from your report, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so that must be what Sergeant Houston said, correct?
I believe so, yes, sir.
I have no further questions, thank you.
Why do you put things in your reports when they're fresh in your mind?
Excuse me, sir.
Why do you put things into your reports when they're fresh into your mind?
To document what was said? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, isn't that why you do it? When you have the most fresh memory and the events are near, you put it in your reports and so you know what was there.
Yes, I believe this is just a summary of what was said as opposed to a documentation of the actual interview itself.
But, well, a bunch of that interview where Krista is basically asking him repeatedly, is this what you said about that same statement? Isn't that true?
If you could repeat the question, sir.
There's a whole interview with Bruce Houston where Krista keeps asking him, basically, is his statement in his report correct? Do you remember that?
I don't remember that, but it's not to say that's not the case.
You and the chief could have very different views about what is reasonable, isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's okay.
Yes, sir.
And that doesn't make it arbitrary or capricious, does it?
I don't suppose so.
Doesn't make it vague, does it?
No, I mean, that's you're asking for my speculation, but
Okay. Did you look into, since you did look at 10306, did you look into this subsection on gratuitous force in your report?
I don't believe it's documented as one of the subsections of the investigation, no, sir.
Wouldn't that be an important thing to want to look at?
I don't believe there was, I mean, depending on how you define restraint, I don't know that there was an allegation that that was violated.
Could you define restraint to being in a holding cell is a type of restraint?
Yes, it's a type of restraint.
So if you had read and considered that, you might have investigated.
I suppose, but again, that was consistent with past practice and customs that we would do that.
So you guys didn't investigate.
I suppose not.
I'm sorry, Ken, what was that last question?
I said, so you guys didn't investigate? I'm sorry, I got a real bad sore throat. I apologize. I can't talk very well. Sorry, I'll try to speak. I have no further questions.
Questions from the board?
You mentioned on direct from Mr. Jansen, you drew a distinction, or he questioned you about a distinction between knocking on a door and pounding on a door.
Yes.
From what I saw in the video, there was some distance between the holding cell that Mr. Baker was in and the booking room.
Yes, sir.
Separated by a hallway, around 30 feet long or so. Would someone in the booking room hear someone knocking on the wooden door?
I would say it would be harder to hear someone just knocking on the door as if to get someone's attention as opposed to striking or pounding on the door.
Okay. You state in your report on page 11 that in response to Baker pounding on the door, Officers Sanders and Kreitz responded to the cell. So they came to the cell when he pounded on the door.
Yes, sir. And
So if one wanted attention, rather than knock on the door, they'd pound on the door.
yes, I also believe that coincided with when they were looking for the Sudicon wipes. But I
Okay.
can't say that for sure.
And then after warning Mr. Baker that if he continues that, he's gonna be put on the ring,
Yes, sir.
they go into a corner, at least in the video, it looked like a corner, I guess it was the door to the booking room.
Into another hallway, yes, sir.
Yeah, and then they waited there, the three of them, talking at a low voice.
Yes, sir.
In your report, quote, in anticipation of him striking the door. They waited there in anticipation of him striking the door.
If I recall correctly, I believe they anticipated that he was going to do it again.
That's in your report.
Yes, sir.
That's a direct quote from your report.
Okay. So,
I'm just thinking, by way of a response. There wasn't likely to be a response to a knock, but he got a response when he pounded. And then he pounded again looking for another response. Now, I'm not saying this guy was bright as bulb on the tree, but he did get a response the first time. And he got a response, not the one he was looking for, but he got a response from the second time he pounded.
yes, sir, I would say that's a correct statement.
So pounding on the door was kind of, in a reward context, it was rewarded by Officer Sanders' behavior. He got a response.
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's what.
Other questions? Steve?
Yes, real quick. So in your investigation, you're determining whether, through the use of force, whether proper medical attention was delivered.
Correct.
And that would have encompassed all Section 8 of the use of force policy, correct?
Yes, I believe that was the section noted.
Okay. So let me ask a couple questions about Section 8.4, bizarre behavior, prolonged struggle. So according to the events of that night, it sounds like there may have been several things in here that would have maybe dove into this section here a little bit. So let me ask this question. Based off your interviews with the police officers, had this person displayed any bizarre aggressive behavior?
Aggressive behavior, definitely.
Okay. Had he been shouting?
Yes, sir.
Had he been displaying paranoia or panic?
I don't recall that being cited by any of the officers.
Okay, maybe not, it's just listed as a
Yes.
symptom here. Violence towards others?
Yes, sir.
Unexpected physical strength?
I mean, I don't know if they expected him to be as strong as what he ended up being. I couldn't speak for them.
I mean, from testimony of the other two officers, even from Officer Sanders, he was pretty strong for his size.
Yes, sir.
Pretty hefty. Elevated body temperature, I don't think anybody took his temperature. So all of those things, can lead to, and during a prolonged struggle, can lead to a risk of sudden death, according to the policy here. Emergency personnel should be summoned to the scene, which they were. Whenever a person displays such symptoms, is involved in a prolonged struggle, as he was that night with the officers. And such person should be positioned on their side, if it can be done safely, and monitored until the arrival of the medical personnel. Were you able to determine whether he was monitored until the medical personnel arrived?
I don't believe there was anyone directly observing him. I believe the station master would have had access to the cameras that would have shown him.
Were you able to verify that the station master was observing him?
I don't recall that specific issue. I know that the officers were in the booking room, which is also in the holding cell area.
So we don't know whether he was monitored?
No, sir.
Okay,
Directly, no, sir.
all right, thank you.
The video, what testimony we've heard today indicates that the prisoner was on the ring for 12 minutes. Is 12 minutes a long time to have somebody on a ring, or a short time, or?
Comparatively, I would say it's fairly short to average,
Might somebody be left on the ring for an hour?
depending on their behavior, yes.
Longer?
Getting longer than an hour, I can't think of an instance where somebody's been on there that long.
But a half hour wouldn't be unusual.
No, not necessarily.
So 12 minutes is not anything out of the
No,
ordinary.
sir.
And Mr. Noyce is trying to make a point that you botched this investigation by the fact that you allowed Mr. Jansen to ask questions when you're interviewing Mr. Sanders. Do you normally let the attorney object to things during an interview like that?
Again, I don't recall any specific instance. I can think of other times where attorneys were present for interviews, and I don't recall ever shutting them down and saying, you can raise whatever point you have at the end. Please don't talk.
But they have been there and they've asked questions before for objections.
I would assume so, but I
You
can't
don't
think of
know.
any particular.
But did it change the outcome? I mean, it's a pain when you're trying to conduct an interview and somebody's always objecting to what you're trying to answer. But did you get the answers to the questions you were trying to get?
Yes, sir. I didn't feel like it rose to the level of interfering with the interview.
How many investigations have you made prior to this?
Depending on what we're referring to, if we're referring to just use of force, we did, like I said, we did investigations as to complaints of violations of policies.
In
This
total,
happened-
how many have you done?
It'd be hard for me to guess. I would say maybe 30 to 40, I don't know.
Okay. And use of force?
Not all use of force, those
Any of
would
them? Were any
entail.
of them use of force?
Yes, sir.
And did anybody have a problem with your investigation methods prior to this?
I don't recall any problems. I don't recall any issues being raised.
Anyone else with this witness? Can he be excused?
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to ask you, the question is, why would you feel appalled, pretty much that they said your investigation was botched?
I think it's,
Like you'd expound on.
I just feel like it's an unfair characterization. I'd like to think that the work product that I do is better than a botched investigation. I take what I do very seriously, and I feel like I do the best job that I can.
So do you feel your integrity was questioned?
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Anyone else? Can the witness be excused or subject to recall?
Excuse me.
Thank you very much, Sergeant, appreciate it. And we'll take a break for 15 minutes here, so we'll be back about 7:03, something like that.